Hi guys, welcome back to Mysteries Channel. I just want to say, hey, thank you for clicking on my video. I hope you guys are all doing well out in the world. And today I kind of want to talk about the origin of language and its evolutionary emergence in the human species. This has been a subject of speculation for centuries. The topic is very difficult to study because, well, there's a lack of direct evidence. And there are many, many theories out there, but that's all they are because there's really no way to prove it one way or another. One of the very first experiments ever documented tried to find the root language of mankind, to figure out who were the first people on the scene. This experiment was done by the Egyptians, and the experiment itself is something that nightmares are made of. And the sad thing is, it's going to be repeated over and over and over again throughout history, all the way up to almost the current day, possibly even the current day, because people just don't either they don't read and trust what other people have come up with, or they're just evil people. The initial experiment is the earliest recorded psychological experiment, reported about 429 BC in the Histories, Part 1, Book 2, Paragraph 2 of the Greek historian Herodotus. The Histories is the first history book, if you will, or at least the earliest history book that we have on record. And if you're interested in reading this book, I will put a link below because you can go on to Gutenberg.org and read it for free. So when I was researching about this experiment, I didn't actually go to read Herodotus at first. I went to see what the accounts that were out there. And there was one about a shepherd being given to children to raise, where never a word could be uttered to them. There was another one where, it wasn't a shepherd. He had cut out the tongues of mothers and then made it so they could never speak to their children to see what word they would utter first. And then there were a couple other ones. So I was like, shoot, I better go and check out the histories and see what Herodotus himself says. So this is what he says, but in the way that I speak, not in the way that he speaks. Again, the link will be in the description box. You can actually read it out of his own mouth. In the time before the pharaoh Psammetichus I, the Egyptians wanted to know what man first came into being. Psammetichus is recorded in history from about 664 to 610 BC, and once he becomes pharaoh, he sets about to figure this out. The pharaoh had many scribes pore over records and travel and call upon others, but there were no new leads. Like, the Egyptians thought that they were the first on the scene, except for maybe one other group. That group, they're called the Phrygians. And they were the only other group that the Egyptians thought may have been there before they themselves had come into being. You see, the Egyptians supposed that the Phrygians came into being before themselves, but they themselves before all other men. The Phrygians in classical antiquity were the people of a kingdom to the west central part of Anatolia. This is now the area we call Turkey. Now, if you go down the rabbit hole for a little bit, you'll find that the Phrygians migrated from Haemus Mons. The Haemus Mons are now called the Balkans, and the Balkans are like the mountainous landmass that is across the sea from Italy. In fact, these mountains are very steeped in legend, and the classical etymology derived from the name Haemus is from a myth about Zeus and the dragon Typhon. He was again driven to Thrace and hurled entire mountains at Zeus in the battle around Mount Haemus. When these bounced back upon him under the force of the lightning bolt, blood gushed out of the mountains. And from this, they say the mountain is called Haemus. Haemus means bloody. Okay, now back to the experiment. The pharaoh went through all of his inquiries. He couldn't find a verifiable answer, so he devised a plan. The plan was to take 2 newborn children belonging to persons of common sort, of course, because you would never do that to someone that has means, I'm just saying. He would give them to a shepherd to bring up in the place where he kept his flock. The children were brought up in a manner in which they would never hear a word uttered in their presence. They would be separated and placed by themselves in a room where none might come. In the proper time, the shepherd would bring them she-goats, and once they were satisfied with that milk, he would do whatever else they needed. They would be bathed and clothed, but never once would someone utter or coo to them. Now the pharaoh sets this all up, and he makes it known. These instructions must be strictly adhered to. And when the children utter their first word, to come back and tell him what it is. Now the pharaoh told him the first words or word is of great importance, and to make sure that you come after the children cease from wailings without sense. He doesn't want to hear the goos and the ga's or the ba's. He wants something that sounds like an actual word. Now, it's said that after a space of about 2 years, during which the shepherd went on acting as commanded, at length, when he opened the door and entered, both children fell before him and uttered the word Bikos, stretching forth their hands. At first, when he heard this, the shepherd kept silent, but since this word was often repeated as he visited them constantly and attended to them, he then brought the children before the Pharaoh. Once they were before the Pharaoh, Psammetichus, having himself heard it, began to inquire what nation of men had anything named Bikos. And in inquiring, he found out the Phrygians had this name for bread. In this manner, guided by the indications such as this time, the Egyptians were brought to allow that the Phrygians were a more ancient people than they themselves. So this is the first psychological experiment on record. And like I said, it's repeated over and over again throughout history. Even though this is some dark shit I had to know, the other times it was repeated, did children say the same thing? The next similar experiment that I found was by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. He was the king of Sicily, Germany, and Jerusalem. He was a controversial man who had a very long conflict with the Pope. I think it's safe to say they both hated one another. He had been excommunicated twice and was known for his immoral nature. He was known as Stupor Mundi, or the astonishment of the world, but not in a good way. Documented by Salimbene de Adam of Parma, an Italian Franciscan monk, Frederick II did many gruesome experiments, but there was one that took the cake. The origins of human language was something that fascinated the emperor greatly, and he embarked upon an experiment that he hoped would prove what the original language of mankind was. He believed that it would be Hebrew, and in his eagerness to determine what language had been given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Frederick gave a group of babies over to the care of nurses who were given strict orders on how to raise them. The nurses were ordered not to interact with the children other than when strictly necessary. The infants would be fed and bathed, but no more. They were never to be spoken to, never to be cooed at, under any circumstances. Tragically, for those involved, Frederick never got an answer to the question he posed, and the original language of mankind remained hidden. The children starved from any form of affection, warmth, and basic interaction, died quite simply from lack of love. It's not known how many times this experiment was done under him, how many children were involved, but always it came back to the same result: death. In the writings of the Franciscan monk, it is clear none of those children survived. Now, I said this experiment had been carried out many times throughout history, and I'm not going to go over them because it's just too dark and sick. All I can say is I find it crazy that this is what people came up with to try to figure out the root race of the world. Languages change over time, and I know the ancient Egyptians had to be well aware of this. In the end, we know that children who aren't exposed to language in infancy through 4 may never learn to speak, on top of a lot of other psychological damage that is done. Did the Egyptians find the root language? I'll say no. No. I do find it interesting that the oldest sites of ancient civilization are found in Turkey, at least now. Who knows in another 100, 200 years where the oldest sites will be. The Phrygian culture spilled into the Hellene culture that came later with shared gods and shared stories. The long and the short of it is, the Egyptians saw only one other civilization that they believed to be older than themselves. When they speak of the experiment, they make it sound like they're trying to find out the first people, not necessarily the first civilization. If it was the innate language of humanity, it must have already been long lost. So I looked a little bit more into the paradox. I found a study that was conducted by Quentin D. Atkinson, a biologist at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. He suggests that language originated only once, and the specific place of the origin may be Southwest Africa. While most studies focus on words and the tracing of how words change over time to trace the birth of modern language, Atkinson zeroed in on something called phonemes. These are the distinctive units of sound by which words are represented. Now, he did this with 500 languages around the world, and by applying mathematical methods to linguistics, Atkinson discovered that the further humans traveled from Africa, the fewer number of phonemes survived. To put this in perspective, many African click languages have click consonants. These are found in the Kosian family of languages, which I think there are 3 languages in this family group. They are chiefly spoken in Southern Africa. These languages have over 100 phonemes. The further you get away from Africa, the less phonemes exist, especially if you try to tie the language path with the dispersal of people out of Africa. I know that this is a very controversial thing. Like in my videos, if I ever get a lot of hatred, it's for this out of Africa thing. But there's a lot of stuff that actually points towards it. genetic testing being one of it, language being another one, obviously. African languages, there were 100 phonemes being spoken through their language. The further you get away from Africa, especially if you follow the chart of dispersal out of Africa, the fewer phonemes exist. So if you're in Papua New Guinea or New Zealand or Oceania as a whole, they will have as few as 13. The modern English language has approximately 45. So his findings challenged the long-held belief by linguistics that the origin of spoken language dates back some 100,000 years. So then I started looking at modern theories, other theories that don't apply the mathematical base to it, the ones that are held through people that study linguistics. There are so many different theories on this, I can't even go through all of them. It would take a lifetime to learn them all, but they kind of fall under certain held assumptions. There is a continuity theory built on the idea that language exhibits so much complexity that one cannot imagine it simply appearing from nothing in its final form. Therefore, it must have evolved from earlier pre-linguistic systems among other primates. I think what they're suggesting here is communication started with hand movements and grunts, and then over time became what we do today, communicate through speech. Now there is also the discontinuity theories, and they take the opposite approach, and that is that language is a unique trait. It can't be found among any other non-humans. It must have appeared suddenly during the course of human evolution. Noam Chomsky's theory kind of goes with that. Now some theories consider language mostly as an innate faculty, largely genetically encoded. Other theories regard language as mainly a cultural system learned only through social interaction. Like I said, I'm not going to go through all the theories out there, but these are the main principles of the theories that are held. Some people believe that language developed over time because it helped to facilitate tool making or give direction to food sources. Some believe that it appeared out of a single human mutation fairly abruptly. This is Noam Chomsky's belief, that a single genetic mutation occurred with one Homo sapien, and then through breeding that took about 6,000 generations, we are what we are now. Others believe that one small change through evolution, but not actually related to our vocals, facilitated language because of a form of necessity. An example of this could be, as these hominids began to lose their hair and their fur, it made it impossible for infants and children to hang on to their mothers, forcing mothers to use their hands to hold their young. With our hands now occupied, we can no longer communicate in the way that we used to do it, with gestures and grunts still existed, but our hands were now tied up. You may have been holding an infant while foraging or fight something off or hanging on to a tree or a rock. Your hands were now both occupied. You could no longer communicate in the fashion that had always been. So that forced a new form of communication. And after all I read, I don't think that it was spontaneous genetic mutation. From the experiments that happened over time, we know for a fact language is not innate. We have the capacity to do it, but it is learned. You have to have someone interacting with you with language in order for you to pick it up and speak it. I look more deeply into this than I think I do other stuff, because I do think language is fascinating stuff. I think not only the fact that we have the capacity to do it, it is what we feel differentiates us from animals, is our ability to speak. I'm no closer at knowing what the root language was, but I don't think it started with us. Let me put it to you this way. We know for a fact we bred with Neanderthal, we bred with Denisovan, and we bred with Homo erectus. This is a genetic fact that we can find out just through looking at genetics. Would we be breeding with somebody that much inferior to us? I don't think so. I think that we were communicating with one another. If we really want to look at the longevity of what could possibly be Homo sapien, I truly think we need to look at Homo erectus. They were on the scene for 2 million years. I guarantee you, we were verbalizing with each other in one fashion or another, and it wasn't just grunts and clicks. There was something else going on there. When you look at the progression of that being, you can 100% see that they learned and improved everything that they did. You can see their very primitive tools and how far they came to make those tools much, much stronger and more reliable. They did this with speaking to one another. They did it with speaking with us. I honestly think that the root language of all mankind happened before we even stepped on the scene. Maybe the reason why we survived, I think there's a twofold reason why we're here and they aren't. The first one is we had a larger capacity for language and to store knowledge. And two, we outbred them. I really think that's what it came down to. Anyway, long story short, kind of went everywhere with this one. in the end, I feel like language began somewhere else. Anyway, sorry for the long video and the rambling. I hope you guys have yourselves a very great day.